It's good to see everybody out this morning. I hope that you have enjoyed the service so far. It's been a real pleasure to be here, and I hope you have felt the same way. This morning, we are going to continue a series of sermons that we began the last couple of times that I spoke. And what these sermons are about are reasons and the evidence that we have for what we believe. And I wanted to start this morning with just a very brief summary of where we've been so far in the first two lessons. In the first lesson, we talked about why it is okay for us to seek evidence, that God always intended for us to have evidence of himself and evidence for what you and I believe. And we went through scripture that talked about why it's okay that we shouldn't have to, nor should we think that we are required to make some blind leap of faith without any evidence. But God has always provided us evidence for what we believe. And then in the last sermon, what we talked about is we began to go through some of that evidence, and we talked about the cosmological argument for God. And you'll remember that in that sermon, if you were here, what we talked about was the fact that the very existence of this cosmos, the very existence of this universe, our presence here can only really be explained by God, because there has to be a beginning and there has to be a directing power in this world. And I won't get into all the details of that again, but we tried to talk about that. This morning, we're going to talk about something, as you can see on the screen, called the teleological evidence for God. And I'll explain what that means here in just a minute. But before we begin this morning, I want to reiterate something that I had said earlier. These topics are fairly technical, especially these early sermons. They are fairly technical. And as a result, it's impossible for me to go through all of the different evidence or to explain it in the detail that maybe you'd get in a college class or something like that. And so if you have questions after we're done or at any time, and you want to ask those questions, I'd be more than happy to sit down and talk with you, and others who know this stuff would be very happy to sit down and talk with you as well. But I just want to preface by saying that we're not going to get into every jot and tittle. And so if you're watching on the live stream or later and you have questions, as we said before, please email us, let us know. We'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have about some of the evidence and some of the topics that we're going to cover in this sermon and in other sermons later. Okay, so today we're going to talk about the teleological evidence for God. I'm going to begin in the 8th Psalm and in the first 4 verses of the 8th Psalm, where it says, O Lord, our Lord, how excellent is thy name in all the earth, who has set thy glory above the heaven. Out of the mouth of babes and sucklings hast thou ordained strength because of thine enemies, that thou mightest still the enemy and the avenger. When I consider thy heavens, the work of thy fingers, the moon and the stars which thou hast ordained, what is man, that thou art mindful of him, and the son of man, that thou visitest him? We have read this particular verse before. We'll read it a few more times probably before we're done, because this is one of the verses, one of them, not the only one. It's one of my favorites, but it's one of the verses that talks about how God has given us evidence and that God has pointed to his creation and told us, go look at my creation. It will tell you about me. It will explain me to you. And so we're going to try and do a little bit of that this morning as we started doing the last sermon that we have. Now let's talk about what I mean by teleological evidence. That's a big fancy name, and it's pretty easy once we break it down into its constituent parts. Telos means the end, the purpose, or the goal. That's what that means. And of course, logical means the study of the end, purpose, or goal. And so this is an argument that says that the evidence of God's existence can be gleaned from the evident, purposeful design of the universe. Last time we talked about the existence of the universe. This morning we're going to talk about some characteristics of the universe that lead us to understand that there must be a God. Now I want to be clear. We're not proving God exists in the sense of a mathematical proof. And so it's not going to be as simple as 2 + 2 = 4. If it was, well, this would be a much different discussion. As I've said, I think before, but I'll say today, this is more like being in a courtroom. In a courtroom, you don't really have the luxury of being able to prove something to an absolute certainty unless you've got videotapes or something like that. And so what lawyers do in a courtroom is they put forth evidence. The One side will put forth this evidence, another side puts forth its evidence, and the jury has to decide, based on the evidence before them, which side they believe and what truth they think is really the truth. They have to be able to decide that, or what version of events is really the truth. And so what we are doing in this series of sermons is we're laying out the evidence for God. We're also, to try and be honest here, we're going to talk about some of the responses as we go along so that we can all weigh out all the different things. And I'm not going to tell you that I'm going to do all of that just to the nth degree, but we are going to talk about these things as we go through this sermon. So we're going to lay out the evidence. And the point is, at the end of these series of sermons, what I hope you get to the point of is that you look at the evidence and you go, wow, there has to be a God, and that God is the God that I worship. Because I think the evidence is overwhelming that that is the case. We're going to put another building block on the stack of evidence this morning with the teleological evidence. There is something called the anthropic principle, and it really is at the heart of what we're going to discuss today. The anthropic principle is a scientific or philosophical principle that notes that the universe has attributes or characteristics that are exactly what they need to be for life as we know it to exist. In other words, this principle holds that the universe appears to have been fine-tuned for life. And we'll get into that in detail as we go through our sermon this morning. But that's the principle, that the universe is specifically designed for you and I to exist. In other words, all of the seeming arbitrary and unrelated constants in physics and in science have one strange thing in common, and that is that they are precisely, and I'm not talking about, oh, they're in the range. They are precisely the values that they need to be for life to exist as we know it. And we're going to talk about some examples of that as we go through our sermon this morning, and there are many more that we are not going to be able to get. In doing this, I've given these series of sermons before, and I went back and I'm trying to redo these and put new information in them so that those of you who've had to suffer through this once or twice before will find something new. And I can't tell you how much information is on the cutting room floor, so to speak, when I get to the end of this. There are just multitudes of bodies of evidence that I just can't get to because we don't have enough time, and we'd have to go through a lot of explanation. So we're going to hit the high points this morning, but I think you're going to find that these high points more than get the job done when we talk about how fine-tuned this universe is. So here's the argument. The fine-tuning of the universe has to be the result of one of three things. If we have to look at the universe and say, okay, it's the way it is because it was necessary, it's a physical necessity that it be that way. Or we look at the universe and we go, okay, it's the way it is because it's just a chance, it just happened that way. It just, it could have happened a lot of different ways, but we hit the lotto and it just happens to be this way. So yay, we exist. Or we conclude that there is a designer, that someone specifically designed this universe for us to be here. The argument goes that the fine-tuning of the universe is not due to physical necessity or chance. That's what we're going to talk about this morning. And as a result of that, if we eliminate physical necessity and if we eliminate chance, then there's only one option left, and that is a design. That somebody made this universe so that you and I can be here. The 19th Psalm, the first three verses of the 19th Psalm say, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork. Day unto day uttereth speech, and night unto night showeth knowledge. There is no speech nor language where their voice is not heard. Whenever you go out at night and you look up at the stars in the heavens, whether you realize this or not, God is speaking to you. Those things that you observe in nature, God's speaking to you. When you observe all of the little fine-tuned things in this world, God is speaking to you. One of the things that hit the cutting room floor, Christy was really lobbying hard during our trip this weekend. She was showing me pictures of all these things in nature that are just really small and intricate and you need to put that, and I just don't have time to do all of these. But my point is, when we see all of those little intricate things, that's God speaking to us day into day and night into night. He utters speech and shows knowledge. Acts 17, verses 24 through 26, it says, their God that made the world and all things therein, seeing that he is Lord of heaven and earth, dwelleth not in temples made with hands, Neither is worship with men's hands as though he needeth anything, seeing he giveth to all life and breath and all things, and hath made of one blood all nations of men for to dwell on the face of the earth, and hath determined the times before appointed and the bounds of their habitation. God has put in order this universe, and he has made very precise and intelligent and thoughtful decisions about the way this universe needs to be. And we'll talk about that as we go through. But before we get there, I want to talk about what some scientists say when they look at the way this universe is ordered. And we're going to go through several quotes here. First one's from a fellow by the name of Sir Fred Hoyle. Sir Fred Hoyle, really at the beginning, was an atheist. But as he began to study science, he began to question that. And you'll see here that he's a very distinguished, all these fellows are people that we're going to discuss are very distinguished. He is the director of the Institute of Astronomy at Cambridge in Great Britain. And he says a common sense interpretation of the facts when we look at the universe suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with the physics as well as chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. The numbers one calculates from the facts seem to me so overwhelming as to put this conclusion almost beyond question. What he's saying here is when I look at the evidence and I look at how ordered this universe is, we can't say this is by chance. That's just a silly argument. It's silly because the numbers, it is astronomical, the odds that we would just happen upon this universe. Another individual, Charles Towns, who's a professor at Columbia and at the University of University of California, Berkeley. He also is a Nobel laureate. He has a Nobel Prize in physics. Says physicists are running into stone walls of things that seem to reflect intelligence at work in natural law. This is one of the great problems of science. You know, a lot of times as Christians, we are brought up in a world that teaches us that science and religion conflict. And that, you know, if you believe in science, then you're not a Christian. And if you're a Christian, you don't believe in science. And what's really happening in the world is the more scientists look, the more scientists experiment, the more scientists figure out, what they keep running into is this universe looks pretty ordered. This universe looks like somebody made it. And all of the arguments that everybody used to use about why this can't be the case and why the universe is all there ever was and all there ever will be, like Carl Sagan said one time, all of that is running headlong into hard scientific facts that are being discovered every day. Don't think that science is conflicting with your Christianity. Those things are converging the more we find out about scientific evidence in this world. Paul Davies, who's a professor at Arizona State University, he's also the chair of SETI, which is a government organization that looks for extraterrestrial life. He looks at the universe and he says the impression of design is overwhelming. He says, I look at the evidence, I look at what's out there, I've been studying this all my life, and when I look at how this universe is ordered, the impression of intelligence or of design is overwhelming. Ed Harrison, who's at the University of Massachusetts, says the fine-tuning of the universe provides prima facie evidence, that means evidence that stands on its own face, of deistic, that means God, design. Take your choice, blind chance that requires multitudes of universes, or design that requires only one. So this fellow says, look, the fine-tuning of the universe is prima facie evidence. It is evidence that stands on its own that there is a God that designed this world. Edward Kolb, who is a dean of physical sciences at the University of Chicago, says the universe, it seems, is fine-tuned to let life and consciousness flower. Freeman Dyson, who is a theoretical physicist and a mathematician at Princeton, says the more I examine the universe and the details of its architecture, the more evidence I find that the universe, in some sense, must have known we were coming. And, he can't bring himself to say that I look at the fine-tuning and there's a God. He says, I look at this and the universe must have known we were coming. It's just so fine-tuned for our existence. Luke Barnes, who's a theoretical astrophysicist in Australia at Sydney University or Western Sydney University, says fine-tuning suggests that at the deepest level that physics has reached, the universe is well put together. The whole system seems well thought out, something that someone planned and created. And Sir Isaac Newton, I'm sure most of you have heard of him. Sir Isaac Newton, whenever he was writing, said, the most beautiful system of sun, planets, and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. Folks, when we look at the evidence of the universe, when we look at what's around us, we are simply going to be overwhelmed with how well designed this universe is. Now let's get into some of the specifics. I've been telling you what people have been saying, and that's all very impressive to hear all these scientists and Nobel laureates and everybody else tell us about how fine-tuned this universe is. But what are they talking about, and why would they say some of the things that they're saying? Well, let's look at that. You know, if you landed on Mars, just indulge me here a little bit. Let's say you landed on Mars and you stepped out of your Mars lander and you saw this picture. What would be your reaction if you saw that? You saw that picture, would you go, oh, well, that's interesting. I can't believe that over the billions and billions and billions of years that Mars existed, that somehow the wind and the rain and everything else just kind of, because there used to be rain on Mars, allegedly. Anyway, all the elements just kind of mixed together, and over time and over all the billions of years, it made this. Or would you say, you know what, somebody's been here and built a building? Well, we would all look at that and we would say, somebody's been here and built a building. We wouldn't say, well, I guess just in billions of years, things just happened where it came that way. Well, this universe is like that. When we look at the universe, it's like looking at this building and going, you know what? Total accident, just blind chance. The universe just kind of has been rolling along for billions of years, and over time, we just all happen to exist. It's just as silly as looking at this and saying that. It just happened to exist. It is so evidently designed. We know it. And we're deluding ourselves whenever we try and run away from that. So let's talk about gravity. Like I said, we're going to talk about some technical things. I'm going to try and keep it as simple as I can. If you have questions, please talk with me afterwards or ask questions, send an email, whatever you need to do to ask any questions that you have. But gravity, we all know what gravity is. As we get older, we become more and more inclined with what gravity is. Gravity is the force that pulls things down, and it's the attraction force that we know that kind of holds us to the earth. You know, it's, believe it or not, one of the weakest forces in nature. When we look at all the forces of nature, gravity is one of the weakest forces that there possibly could be. It's not a very strong force. On the other end of that spectrum is something we call the strong nuclear force. This is the force that holds atoms together. It is extraordinarily strong. And it is about, as I've said there, 10,000 billion times stronger than gravity. So that's the strongest force that any scientist, physics has ever encountered, is the strong nuclear force. So if we had a radio dial and we put the strong nuclear force all the way over here where 107.5 is on your radio dial, for those of you who used to use radio dials, all the way over here, and then we walked all the way over here, and we put gravity all the way down here where the channels nobody listens to are, you know, the 88.1 that plays classical music at midnight. That one, if that's the gravity on this side, and we made that a radio dial, and we stretched that radio dial all across the universe. Okay, so that radio dial is the width of the universe. It would be billions and billions of inches, that radio dial, with gravity at one end and the strong nuclear force at the other. Now, if we moved gravity 1 inch on this radio dial, it would increase gravity by about 1 billion times. That's how tremendously different these forces are. So with strong nuclear force over here, gravity over here, billions of inches in between them. If we just took gravity and went whoop over just 1 inch, gravity's 1 billion times stronger. Now, those of you who feel like gravity is affecting you as you grow older, you don't want it to be 1 billion times stronger. It will affect you a lot more. Okay? Now, why does this matter? If we increased it by 1 inch, here's what would happen. Animals would be crushed. You would too. The Earth's diameter would be 40 feet. Those of you who dreamed of taking an around the world tour could do that in about 30 seconds. You could just walk around the Earth because it's only 40 feet around to get there. Many elements that we know many elements could not be formed. As a matter of fact, the only elements really that would be formed are elements that are heavier than carbon and oxygen. And you need a lot of those elements that are lighter than that to be here. And that's if we just moved gravity 1 inch on this radio dial. Just 1 inch out of the billions and billions of inches that any force could have possibly been. That's the difference. And if we decreased it, let's say we moved it just a little further to the left, well, then the stars would not get hot enough to produce carbon. So we would have no carbon. You may have heard that you are a carbon-based life form. Do you know what it means if we live in a universe that can't produce carbon? You are not here. None of the plant matter and animals that we see around are here because we're all carbon-based. There's a lot of reasons for that. This is where I don't get into all the specifics. But that is the result of gravity and how finely tuned that force is. If it was just an inch either way on this billions and billions and billions of inches across the universe, it would destroy us either way. There's something called the cosmological constant. The cosmological constant is the energy density of space that drives the expansion rate of the universe. It is the amount of matter and the way it was arranged whenever the universe was created, however that happened. And as it expands out, it determines and it drives how fast the universe is expanding apart, and it's a force that operates. If it was large and positive, it would be a repulsive force. It would be spreading things out so fast that matter couldn't even clump together. So you wouldn't have any matter to be made of, because matter wouldn't exist if this force was too heavy. And if it was large and negative, then the universe would collapse into a black hole and we wouldn't be here. Now, the fine-tuning of this matter and for this matter and universe to exist, originally, the scientists thought that it was a 1 in 10 to the 53rd fine-tuning. And what that means is it is a 1 in 100 million, billion, 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 billion. I think I got that right. I might have missed a billion or added one here. But that's how fine-tuned it is. Of all the different possible combinations that the energy density could have had, that of how matter could have been arranged, of how much force there is here, that cosmological constant, it had to be, of all the possible variables, it is a 1 in 10 to the 53rd chance, a 1 in 100 million, billion, 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 billion chance. Now, some of you may have seen odds before. Those are not good odds. You should not bet the farm on that. And so it looks something like that when you write it out. 1 in all of those zeros. And that's what scientists thought for a long time. But as I said, the more we learn and the more scientific work that is done, we learn more. And as we learn more, scientists now almost universally agree, this is not very controversial, that number really is 1 in times 10 to, or 10 times 10 to the 90th power, which means that we have to add another 37 zeros to this number, and it looks something like that. Those are the odds that the original energy density of space would have been correct, such that you and I could exist today. There's lots of ways that could have been organized. There's lots of forces it could have had. We are a 1 in whatever that is. I actually had this. I actually looked it up. I Googled it, and there's weird names. It's like a quintillion, billion, I don't know, something. I didn't even want to try and say it. It's 1 in that much that we would be able to exist today. And that's the cosmological constant. Now I want you to think about all the planets and the stars and the asteroids and the comets and the moons and all the dust in the universe. Think about all of that. You've seen these pictures, the Hubble telescope, and you've seen all of these galaxies, and you've seen all of these planets, and you've seen all of this around. Think about all of that. Think about the world and the moon and Jupiter and Venus and Saturn, and we can multiply that many times because there's galaxies all over the place. Now, imagine that we take all of the subatomic particles in the universe. Now, these are not atoms. That'd be easier. These are subatomic particles. So those of you who remember a little bit about chemistry, an atom is made out of a couple of things: a proton, a neutron, and an electron. So we're talking about taking all of those, all of the protons, the neutrons, and the electrons. And you have to go anywhere you want in the universe. You can pick your galaxy, pick your planet, pick your speck of dust, and go and find an atom somewhere in there, any atom you want. And then when you get to that atom, you need to pick a subatomic particle. What are the chances that if we marked a subatomic particle somewhere in the universe that you would find that? Well, that seems pretty ridiculous. That is 1 with 80 zeros, or 10 with 80 zeros. You still have 10 more zeros to add to get to how unlikely it is that the cosmological constant would be fine-tuned enough for us to live. Do you understand what I'm saying? The chances of this happening by chance are lower than the chances of you going anywhere in the universe and finding some subatomic particle and it just happened to be the one that we painted red so that you could find it and get it and you win the universal lottery. It's worse than that. And those 10 zeros mean a lot. What it basically means is you have zero chance because of the exponential power of adding zeros. It means that there is essentially no chance. And so, like I said, it means that the right subatomic particle in the universe would be 10 billion times better. You would have a 10 billion times better chance of selecting that subatomic particle than it would be that the universal cosmological constant just happens to be right. There's another thing, the ratio of electrons to protons. Now, I know you don't spend a lot of time thinking about this, but scientists do. The ratio of electrons in the universe to protons has to be finely tuned in order for things to exist. And that fine-tuning is 1 with 37 zeros. Now, your odds are better here, right? Because it's not 10 with 90 zeros, it's 10 and 37 zeros. So let's see if you want to take that bet. What are the chances that you would select that degree of fine-tuning? That is equivalent to taking the entire North American continent and covering it up with dimes, up to the moon, a height of 239,000 miles. So you've got dimes covering all the face of North America, going up to the moon for 239,000 miles. Now, that sounds daunting, but you then have to do that on 1 billion similar-sized continents. And then we're going to paint one of those dimes red, and you get to pick that. That's the chance of you selecting 1 out of 10 to the 37th power. And so the fine-tuning of the ratio of electrons to protons is amazingly fine-tuned. The mass of neutrons, this is a fundamental particle or fundamental subatomic particle in the universe. If we increased that by 1 part in 700, or by just 0.15%, nuclear fusion would stop. Now, the reason that's important is because nuclear fusion is what creates a lot of our elements, so you wouldn't exist. There wouldn't be anything to make you out of. If we decreased it just barely by just 0.085%, then only neutrons would exist, and we would not be here. All we would have is neutron stars and black holes, and that is not a very happy neighborhood because there is no information, there is no light, there is no matter. And that's just if we move that dial just a little bit. Now, we talked earlier about this strong nuclear force, which is the strongest force that we know. If it was too weak, then stuff wouldn't hold together very well, and we would have nothing in the universe except for hydrogen. That's it. We'd have hydrogen. If it was too strong, we wouldn't have hydrogen. Now, that may or may not be a big deal to you, but if you go back to chemistry and you remember the formula of water, it's H2O. The H is hydrogen. You know what we don't have if we don't have hydrogen? We have no water. That means we're not going to do very well as a species, nor are we ever going to be here as a species. There's another thing called the original space volume, and this is the space of the potential universes that could have been created by the amount of entropy in our universe. In other words, it is the number or the space of potential universes. That's a hard concept for me to really explain in a short period of time. But basically, our universe required a specific amount of order in its initial energy to allow galaxies and solar systems to form. Whenever the universe began, there had to be enough order in it because, remember, we talked about entropy last time. Energy, as it goes and as it works, slowly begins to degrade over time, and it begins to be weaker. Those of you who are getting older can see you have entropy. Things are starting to degrade over time. I'm intimately familiar with this. I was talking to Christy about this. I just had my birthday, and so I've become very familiar with entropy. It gets hammered home every year. And so as things get older, as we run, it kind of winds down like a clock. So in order for us to be here today and to have galaxies and planets and stars, there had to be a certain amount of order at the beginning because that order is decreasing over time. So for us to be here, there had to be enough order at the beginning for us to be here today. That's kind of the point here. To select a universe that would allow life to exist and obey the laws of thermodynamics that we have here today requires fine-tuning of 1 in 10 billion multiplied by itself 123 times, which is more zeros. Now, I'm not talking about the number. I'm talking about the number of zeros in this number is more than all of the protons and neutrons in the universe. The order of the universe at the moment that it was created had to be so specifically fine-tuned for us to be here from all the other possibilities. It is just astronomical to think about it being anything else. There's a lot of other fine-tuning that we could talk about this morning that we're not going to get into. But we could talk about things like the tilt of the Earth's axis. That has to be exactly precise for us to live here on this world. The orbit of the Earth. If the Earth was a little closer to the sun, this place wouldn't be very fun to live. We'd all be burned up to a crisp. If we were just a little further away from the sun, we'd all be frozen to death and none of us would live. That orbit has to be very precise. The distance of the Earth from the sun is part of that. The orbit has to do with how far and how close we get. The distance, the actual distance, is also something that's fine-tuned. The mix of elements in the atmosphere. This air we breathe, you may take it for granted, but it is a finely tuned mixture of gases, nitrogen and oxygen and other things that you breathe. Sometimes you think you just breathe pure oxygen. You don't. You only do that when you're in the hospital. When you're breathing in normal life, you're breathing a mixture of gases in this world. That mixture is finely tuned for us to be able to live. Earth's gravitational interaction with the moon has to be finely tuned for us to be able to live. If it was too strong, the moon come crashing into us. The size of the Earth has to be finely tuned. It's a size that allows us to live. Earth's magnetic field is another thing that has to be finely tuned. The decay rate of protons is another thing that has to be finely tuned. And there's much, much more. Christy's got a million pictures if you want to see them after services. She can show you all the little pretty things that she found that are just microscopically small and intricate. Chris Williams sent me a picture similar to that just a few days ago. This world is just full of it. I mean, you just look around and how ordered. There's order everywhere. And that, you have to ask yourself, folks, is that something that just happened or was that designed? So the first question, remember our argument. If there's all this fine-tuning, we can't talk about it all this morning, but it has to be one of three things. It has to be either physical necessity, it has to be chance, or we have to conclude that there is a designer. So let's investigate first physical necessity. Are these things the way they are because they had to be that way? Nobody believes this. Nobody believes. Not even the staunchest atheistic scientist in the world believes that things had to be this way because they know they didn't. Because there's lots of other possibilities, and you could, just by changing a few things about the way the Earth was created or the way the expansion is happening or anything else, would make a dramatic difference. So literally go find the biggest atheist who wears it proudly on their sleeve in any prestigious university in the world and ask them, do you think the world is here because it just had to be this way? They would say, absolutely not. Nobody believes this. There is no physical necessity why these various things that we've talked about have to be ordered and fine-tuned and precisely this way. Scientists just reject that. That's not even remotely possible. So we're left then with the second thing, and that's chance. You may remember this. This is that famous scene from the end of one of those shows maybe you saw. I think this is from MASH, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe wrong, but I think I got the scene from MASH whenever the helicopter takes off and they leave. And they spelled out goodbye. Now, look, if you were in a helicopter and you took off and you looked down, would you go, well, this is kind of like this Mars thing we were talking about earlier. You'd look down at this and go, well, if Christy and I were in the helicopter, I looked over at Christy and go, isn't that interesting? And she goes, what? I said, well, just all the rocks that fell and all the ways that the waves have pushed them around and the winds have moved them, just over the millions and billions of years that the Earth's been here, it just happened to spell out goodbye. Isn't that amazing? What do you think Christy would do? She'd check me into a hospital? Because that's crazy? Because nobody believes that? Because obviously when we look at something like that, we go, man, somebody put those rocks in order to spell out goodbye. We get that, just like the Mars building we talked about earlier. Folks, I want you to understand the evidence is such that when we look at the way the universe is created, the idea that all of these various things are just exactly right and that happened by chance, that is just not tenable. It's not believable. Now remember, we started this series of sermons talking about how the belief in God sometimes is under attack. And it's often under attack from academia. We've got folks here in school, some folks that are in college. They will go either in their classes here in Baytown or in their college careers, and they're going to hear people talk about things like this and say, well, we don't know that there's a God or there is no God. We have all the belief in God contradicts science and all this stuff. Folks, that is someone who has got a belief in science so much that they're suspending just reason and common logic. They believe in science so much that they look at a picture like that and they say it's an accident. Now, they want you to believe that you're the one who has the problem with believing things that are silly. Because we look at a universe that is so finely tuned and so intricately designed, and we go, you know what? Somebody designed this. And they look at it and they go, you know what? This is pretty designed. Looks like somebody designed it, but it's just a figment of your imagination. This is just an accident. And we're the crazy ones. And so remember that, you young people who are in school, as you go through your career, you're going to hear people with a lot of credentials. They're going to seem to be more impressive, and they're going to seem like they know everything. They're going to have maybe some letters after the name like PhD or other things, and you're going to think, wow, well, they just know a lot more than me, and maybe they do, and I'm sure they probably do, unless any of you are young geniuses. We may have a few here, but probably somebody who's got a PhD is going to know more than you about science. But let me tell you something, knowing more about science doesn't help you here. Because what all scientists agree is that this universe is pretty finely tuned. And the debate is whether we can suspend reason and say it's just an accident, or we look at that and we go, you know what, there's a God. There's a God who created this place. And he is somebody that we ought to deal with. And so you and I have to decide that, but don't let yourself be intimidated when you get into a college or when you get into a classroom and a teacher starts telling you something that contradicts this. You're not dumb for believing in God. You're being reasonable and logical, and you're doing it based on evidence. What is questionable is the reason and logic of somebody that would look at something so finely tuned and try to argue that it happened by accident. So chance just doesn't work. So that means we're left in the teleological argument with only one conclusion. The fine-tuning of the universe has to be the result of physical necessity, chance, or design. Nobody believes physical necessity. Chance is silly. And so we're left with design. And so therefore, the universe must be so finely tuned because it was designed to be that way. That is the teleological argument. Now I want to talk about some responses that have been made to this. And look, one of these theories at least is one that has been fairly debunked. So we're not going to get into it too much. But I want to just give you a flavor. I'm not going to get to all of them. I'm not going to describe them all in detail, but I want to give you a flavor of the kind of things that people have come up with to try and rebut the idea that there's a God based on this fine-tuning. And we won't get into all the details of it, but I want you to just take it in for what it is and ask yourself, what is more reasonable? What is the more reasonable belief? The first thing is something we call the oscillating universe, and we'll talk more about that here in just a sec. But you'll remember that this is the idea that the universe expands and contracts and expands and contracts. It oscillates back and forth. And the idea is that if the universe is expanding and contracting and expanding and contracting, what that means is we get a lot of different chances for the universe to create itself. And the idea is if we have enough oscillations, if there's enough creation events, maybe we hit the lottery. Like, if you go to a store and you buy lotto tickets all day, every day, and you buy there was a guy who actually did this in Texas. I think he bought every possible number combination in Texas and won the lottery, and they had to have there was a big fuss about it because whether that was cheating or not. But anyway, that's a whole different animal. Don't recommend you going and buying all the lottery tickets at the store. That's not the point. My point is that that's the idea behind the oscillating universe, is that if we have enough chances of creation, eventually we'll hit the one that works. That's a lot of universes, because again, we're talking about a lot of zeros. The multi-universe theory, there's no proof of this. We'll talk about that just a little bit more in a second. This is that there's a whole lot of other universes out there. You may think you're alone, but you're not. There's other universes that you can't see. And if we have enough of those universes hanging around, then maybe we'll hit the right one. And then there's something called evolutionary cosmology, and I'll speak to that right now because we're not going to cover that in detail. Evolutionary cosmology is, again, I want you to ask yourself what's more reasonable. The idea here is that there are black holes and they are portals to other universes. Okay? I mean, it sounds like we've now turned on the Sci-Fi Channel. So there are black holes in the universe, and those black holes, if you went down into them, you would pop up in another universe. And so what happens is all of the information from this universe is being transported through this black hole to another universe. Now, the idea is that as that happens, there are, like Darwinism, we'll talk about that maybe a little later, but like Darwinism where there's variations and things get messed up and there's permutations, and that's how we go from a fish to a reptile to a monkey to a human, and that's how we get there. Again, a silly theory. We'll talk more about that later. But my point is, this is kind of like that on the cosmic scale, that if we have enough black holes that are creating enough other universes, again, that we'll have enough that eventually one time, whenever we pop through the black hole, we'll come up into a universe that's ours, that just happens to be the right one where we can live. And, I want you to ask yourself as we go through these, whether that makes more sense than just believing in God. So this is the oscillating universe that I've tried to explain before, but I wanted to give you a picture of it. It starts with the Big Bang, a very small, singular, energy-dense particle that explodes. And when it explodes, it expands. We're in the middle of an expansion right now. But eventually it loses its energy, and then it crunches all back together again and back into that little energy-dense thing. And then whenever it collapses back down again, it explodes again. And it goes back up, and it expands until it runs out of energy, and then it collapses back down to this thing again. And so, as I've explained, this is like the paddle ball. So the universe is like that paddle ball on that rubber band, and it goes out and it comes back in. It goes out, it comes back in. It goes out and it comes back in. Now, there are a lot of problems with this oscillating theory. One of the problems is where did we get the paddle ball from? Okay, it's all great to say that, okay, here's why God doesn't exist. We've got this universe, and it's expanding and contracting, expanding and contracting, expanding and contracting. Okay, let's suspend all the laws of thermodynamics that say that's not how this works. But if we just said that could happen, where did that come from? Where did we get the initial little energy ball from? Where did that come from? Nobody's got a good answer for that. And so there are a lot of reasons why this is a silly theory. This is one of those that really nobody holds to anymore, because what science has discovered is that eventually the earth would run out. It's like the paddle ball. When you hit it a few times, it'll kind of bounce back and forth, but eventually, unless you keep shaking the paddle, it'll drop, right? And so unless you keep adding energy to this, it'll eventually stop. So that doesn't work, and most scientists have now walked away from the oscillating theory. And so again, more and more scientific discussions support the notion that the universe will keep expanding and never contract. Eventually what's going to happen is we're just going to die a slow death. The good news is that's going to happen way past any of you are going to be here. And there's probably, we all hope the Lord has returned before we reach the cold death stage of the universe, which is projected to be billions of years in the future. So nothing you have to lie awake at night. Maybe if you've got your heart set on your great, and I'm going to have to go for about another 16, 17 years, grandchildren, we can talk about that. But other than that, it's not a worry for us today. Energy would need to be keep adding to keep this oscillation going. So again, folks don't really believe this. This is the one that gains the most traction today. Believe it or not, this is what a lot of scientists think. And again, this is the competing idea to just believing there's God. They believe that there are multiple universes out there. We're just in one. And there are other universes out there that you and I can't, in other dimensions and other places that you and I cannot see. Where you have brother and sister universes all around you. You just can't see them. Now, just to say it kind of makes me want to giggle a little bit because that sounds fantastic. But, I admit that I guess there could be some experiment, or, we could get a Buck Rogers thing and figure out that maybe there's go where no man has ever gone before, and, maybe slide down a black hole and pop out in another universe and go, wow, they were right. Here's the problem, okay? Nobody has any evidence for this. Do you know that not one person has been to another universe? Nobody's ever seen another universe. Nobody's ever touched another universe. Nobody can tell you what another universe is or where it is or how it got there. It's all theoretical. Sometimes you hear, and it sounds very impressive, so-and-so is a PhD at Berkeley in theoretical physics. You know what theoretical physics means? It means it's physics that's not fact. These are guesses about what might happen or what might not happen. And they're doing experiments to try and see if their theories are correct. Whenever they prove them to be correct, they are no more theoretical. They're just physics, okay? This is theory. It has no evidence to back it up. Now, there are hypotheticals that scientists have come up with. There are things that they say, well, if this and if that, then maybe this. But folks, nobody's ever observed this. Here's the thing. Science wants you to believe in this. They have no evidence to offer you. None. Except the fact that they say, come on, don't believe in God. That's silly. So therefore, believe in this thing that I've made up. And you have the option between choosing between that and choosing to select all of the evidence that we have talked about already and that we're going to talk about through this series of sermons to say, you know what, I think it's more reasonable, more rational to believe that a God exists. I'm telling you, the evidence overwhelmingly supports God. The problems with this multi-universe theory, again, is pure fantasy. There's really no scientific evidence supporting this theory. You may have thought about another one. What's generating the universes? Okay, let's say there's a bunch of universes. Where did they come from? Who made them? Nobody's got an answer to that. So at some point, we always keep reducing ourselves to the beginning, which science has no answer for, which is we can talk about how things that we see changed over time, but the problem is, where did it come from? We've never seen something like that before, but science wants you to believe in these theories, and that doesn't make any sense. Hebrews chapter 3 and verse number 4 says, "For every house is builded by some man, but he that built all things is God." Did you catch that? The writer of Hebrews says you can look at a building and you can say, hey, that's built by a man. When we look at all things, when we look at the universe, it was built by God. See, the Bible tells us that when we look at the universe, we can understand who its creator is. The 14th Psalm says, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt. They have done abominable works. There is none that doeth good. The Bible says it's foolish to say that there is no God. Now, maybe you felt like, well, that's a little harsh. There's a lot of smart people out there. What we're talking about today is why that's foolish. Look, I'm not telling you the people who believe these things are not smart. They're brilliant. They are. You don't win Nobel Prizes. You don't become professors at Cambridge and MIT and Berkeley and not know what you're talking about. They are brilliant. So I'm not questioning the work that they're doing. Here's what I'm questioning. It's what they do with the information that they get. Because what they do is they ask you to believe in something that is theoretical and that is a fantasy, something that they cannot explain, and set aside your Christianity. That's foolish. You can be a very smart person and be foolish. And that is foolish to look at this evidence and say, all of this order was happening by chance. It's not because of a creator. The 19th Psalm, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork. Like we talked about before. Romans chapter 1 says, from the invisible things of him, from the creation of the world, are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. You want to know about God? You want to know about God's creative power? You want to know about how God has been to you? How good God has been to you? Romans chapter 1 says, go look at the things that he has made. That's what it says. We're not doing something out of school here. We're not doing something that God says, well, you should have just trusted me. God says, go look at what I made. It will tell you about me. And that's why Christy loves her little pictures, because they just show God just being interested in just the smallest details of this world. I'm going to end with a confession. Stephen Hawking, a lot of you know him. He was he was portrayed in a very famous movie called The Theory of Everything. He's a very famous physicist, theoretical physicist. He was a chair in Cambridge. He was the man, if you remember, he had MLS and was confined to a wheelchair. Or MLS, is that right? ALS. I knew there was a letter wrong there. ALS, confined to a wheelchair. He did a lot of work in physics. And here's what he said at one point. The odds against a universe like ours emerging out of something like the Big Bang are enormous. I think clearly there are religious implications whenever you start to discuss the origins of the universe. Now, I want to tell you, Stephen Hawking never believed that there was a God. But even Stephen Hawking, looking at all this, goes, you know what? I get it. I get it. I get why people begin to think about God when they look at this. Now, Stephen was so blinded by his faith in science that he couldn't see it. That's sad. And my plea to you this morning is, don't be blinded by science. There used to be a song like that. She blinded me with science, I think, or something. But anyway, the point is, don't be blinded by science. Instead, look at the evidence and come to it with a rational belief. You see, the reason we have this conflict is not because scientists have disproven God. It's because the scientists have developed a religious-like faith in science. And so they have believed and suspended belief to try and advance their own scientific theories and ignored what rational people would look at. Which is why, I've said before and I'll say again in this series of sermons, it takes more faith to be an atheist than it does to be a Christian. Because they believe in things that there really is no evidence for. It's theoretical. We believe in stuff that we can see, touch, and feel. We can observe. We can calculate the odds for. And we can say, you know what? When it's 1 times 10 to the 120th power, and that's the chances, I don't think that's a very good bet. And I choose to believe that there's a God. So I hope that whenever you look at some of this evidence that we've gone through this morning, you will come to the conclusion that the evidence is overwhelming for the fact that there is a God, and we must deal with that God and understand how to serve him. Now look, we're just beginning. And so far we've talked about the cosmological argument, we've talked about the teleological argument. Again, we're just laying bricks on the pile of evidence. Okay, there's a lot more to come. And I'm going to acknowledge something. The evidence that we've talked about so far doesn't tell us that it's the God that you and I worship. I mean, it could be Buddha. It could be a Hindu God. It could be another God. There could be a lot. We're just talking about there is a being that created this universe. As we go through this series of sermons, the evidence that we begin to add is going to show that, you know what, it's the God that you and I know. And it's that God that we need to serve. And we're going to talk more as we go through this series of sermons about why that is. But for now, we should start to begin to see why there's evidence that this world, that there is a creator of this world that we have to deal with. And we have to figure out what that means for us as we live our lives. Now, if you've been taught, you understand that God is the being that created us. He created us perfectly. But he also gave us free will. And so in our free will, whenever he put us on this earth, we did things that transgressed his law and we committed sin. And God, who is both righteous and merciful, has to be righteous. He has to be just. And so whenever we committed sins, the penalty for that sin is death. God didn't want us to die. He wanted us to have a chance to live. And so he sent Jesus on the cross of Calvary to pay that price for us, so that you and I would have the opportunity to live even though we had committed sin. Now, in order to take advantage of that sacrifice, he's asked us to do some things. The first thing we have to do is believe. Believe that he's God and believe that Jesus is the Son of God. Some of the things that we did talk about this morning. Then we have to be willing to repent. We have to look at the sins that we've committed, the things that we did that have transgressed God's law, and we need to say, you know what? Those are things that I should not have done. They're an affront to God. I need to change. And we repent of those things and we seek to change. Doesn't mean we're perfect. We're never going to be. But it means we strive to be perfect. And we try and change our lives. It takes confessing his name before men, and then God has asked us to be baptized for the remission of our sins. His sacrifice was to put Jesus on the cross of Calvary. And then Jesus was buried, and then 3 days later he arose again. And baptism is a representation of that. We go down into the water, we are buried with him in baptism, and we rise to walk in newness of life. And that's why he's asked us to be baptized. It's where we come into contact with the blood of Christ, and is where we achieve salvation of our sins. Not because we merit it, not because we earned it, because we obeyed what God asked us to do to have advantages of that grace and mercy that he has shown us. If you're here this morning, and those things make sense to you, and you have not yet named the name of God, we would love to help you this morning. There is a God, and we must serve him, and we must reckon with him at the end of time. And it's important that we get our lives right with him, and part of that is coming to him and being baptized and being added to his kingdom. If you're here, you've already done that, but maybe you need the prayers of the church for some reason. Maybe there's a problem you're dealing with. Maybe there's a difficulty. Maybe you've got a weakness. Maybe there's just an issue in your life that you need help with, and you just would like to have the prayers of the church. If there's one of either case, won't you please come forward while we stand and sing the song of invitation.